Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Civil War Roundtable. The Union League Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Guided by the United States Constitution and the history, the values, and the spirit of the Union League of Philadelphia, the Legacy Foundation's mission is to create better, educated, more engaged citizen leaders. We do this through a host of programs throughout the year, including scholarships for citizen leaders of the future. We care for one of the great Civil War collections in the United States, and it's used for research of all different types. We have exhibits. In fact, our next exhibit on the history of voting, it's called Ballot Box, in the United States Voting Rights, will open next week to the public. We do lectures like tonight's Civil War Roundtable. In fact, tonight, I know we've topped 50 virtual programs since our first one back in April. All of this is made possible only through the voluntary contributions of members and others that share and want to share these values with others. So I want to thank all of our contributors, in particular our Founders Circle and Lincoln Leaders. And I ask you to look out for our fall appeal, which will be coming your way in the next couple of weeks. Tonight's program will include a Q&A section. So if you look down, you'll see a Q&A button, if you will, if you're watching on Zoom. And you can ask questions anytime during the program, and our speaker will get to as many as he can towards the end of the program. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the historian of the Legacy Foundation, Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
Hey, John, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another Civil War Roundtable. Boy, if you haven't been to Antietam, you need to go there because it's remarkable in its own way. It really is. It's very unique. So I'm really happy to have our speaker, Dave Welker, talking about the cornfield because it was probably the most important part of the whole battle itself. So let me read Dave's bio so you'll know a little bit more about him. So Dave Welker is a professional historian and military analyst for the federal government. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from American University and a bachelor's degree in history and political science from Westminster College. In addition to The Cornfield, Dave has authored 2 other Civil War books, Tempest at Ox Hill, The Battle of Chantilly, a very underrated but very important battle itself, and A Keystone Rebel, The Civil War Diary of Joseph Gary, Hudson's Battery, Mississippi Volunteers. And what makes it interesting is that Gary was born in Pennsylvania, but fought for his adopted state of Mississippi. So that happened. So most important, in some ways, I think, though, more interestingly, Dave was also a Civil War battlefield guide. And if you've done any kind of battlefield tours, there's 2 ways to do it, without a guide and with a guide. And it's much better to do it with a guide. So at the end of the program, we'll talk about Dave's website. And you can also just Google him. But I would highly recommend you take a guided tour with Dave, and especially at Antietam. So on that, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Dave Welker.
Appreciate that. There we go. All right, now I'm unmuted. Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate your having me here tonight. My only regret for this program is that I'm not in Philadelphia enjoying the beauty of the Union League building and getting to see all of you in person, but hopefully perhaps someday that can occur. Let me pull up my presentation and share. There we go. All right. I want to begin by reading a brief quote to set the scene for us as we delve into the cornfield. For the first time in several minutes, Duryea's men could see through the sea of green into the brown and gray fields beyond. They'd covered 245 yards, though taking only minutes to do so, it might have seemed to have taken hours. The 105th New York's John Whiteside recalled, "As we advanced through the field, the enemy artillery opened on us and did us severe damage. Here Rufus Barnard of our company was struck or shot with a solid shot and his head blown from his body. But on we went, paying no attention to those who fell in our ranks, no more than if nothing had happened. Even before reaching the fence at the cornfield's southern end, mini balls made their inevitable appearance. Tearing like an unwanted hailstorm, they ripped through plant and flesh alike. While the corn stood and simply absorbed the shock, Duryier's men continued advancing to resist this fate. Reaching the cornfield's southern end, they finally opened fire on the Rebs. Before we delve into the meat of why David and Margaret Miller's 24-acre cornfield became an icon of national death and suffering, and what happened in that field, I want to talk a bit about why we're here in Maryland at all. We're in Maryland, of course, because Robert E. Lee brought the Army of Northern Virginia there. He's pursuing a number of strategic objectives by going into Maryland. Chief among these is to persuade Britain and France to enter the war. The South had embarked on a strategic plan that mirrored rebels of generations before, when Washington and his compatriots involved the French and fundamentally changed the war to the colonials' advantage. Lee is hoping to do the same thing. Entering Maryland, the campaign goes poorly almost at once, achieving few, perhaps none of the objectives he'd hoped for. And then when Jackson seizes Harper's Ferry, the campaign remains alive, and Lee grasps that slim bit of hope that he can see, and he gathers his army around Sharpsburg, Maryland, not far from the Virginia border itself. It's a last gasp effort to save his campaign and achieve this critical goal of winning a victory on Northern soil to prove the South's worth to Britain. Well, if Robert E. Lee picked the spot for that location, it's George McClellan, commanding the Union Army of the Potomac, who's going to set the stage for how this battle is fought. But more importantly than how McClellan conceives a plan for this action is how McClellan approaches fighting any battle. McClellan is often seen as the general who's too cautious, who's got the slows, as Lincoln famously said, as the man who is afraid to win and so will lose every time. But I think rather than McClellan being too cautious, it is in fact something about George McClellan that colors this battle and colors every battle that George McClellan ever led that will affect how Antietam is fought. And that is that George McClellan is a linear thinker. He can come up with a plan to get from point A to point B. A brilliant man, he was graduated second in his class at West Point, easily learned languages, mastered mathematics and other complicated topics with ease. And it was his linear approach to things that and great mind that allowed him to do this. But in planning a battle, that linear approach means that his plan, with or without flaws, has got to be implemented from start to finish just as he intended. He cannot deviate from it because his own mind won't see an ability to change on the fly or adapt. And so how he conceives the Battle of Antietam is how it must unfold. How he conceives of that really is dependent on, in part, on the terrain. Late on the 15th of September 1862, these were the positions of the two armies. Of course, here we have the Union Army on the east side of Antietam Creek, and here is Lee's Confederate Army. Jackson's command holding the northern half, Longstreet's half of the army straddling the town of Sharpsburg. Now, the plan that McClellan came up with sometime probably early on 16 September is essentially this, and it is a typical West Point planned attack. Phase one will be to attack the Confederate left from the Union right. Phase 2 then will be to attack the opposite end, the Confederate right flank or the left. Once Lee has weakened his center to defend against these flank attacks, then the main and final assault will come in the center. And this will be led by Fitz-John Porter's 5th Corps, featuring the division of the division of U.S. regulars in McClellan's West Point centric mind. This is the most dependable division that he has, and this is the force that's going to finally end this battle. The other advantage to McClellan's plan is that Lee at this point has 3 means to get away from this position. He can go south, or to the bottom of your picture, to Harper's Ferry, but that will have been cut by the 2nd flank. He can go north to Hagerstown by going past the top of your screen, or he can go to the west away from that third arrow. And the advantage of this approach is that if each attack is successful, McClellan will have cut Lee's retreat route off completely. And so this is McClellan's plan that he's going to implement. But before we get into that and talk about the first phase, I want to look at the ground that first battle phase is going to occur on. And this is a period map that shows that ground. Now, the advantage of this particular map is that it shows very neatly the box in which the Battle of the Cornfield is going to be fought. And it shows something that's not on many maps, which is the Miller Farm. Now, to orient ourselves, here's the North Woods, here's the East Woods, and here's the West Woods, all belonging to David and Margaret Miller, whose farmhouse still stands today. What's nice about this map is that it shows you that the Miller's house, the little black dot here, is which is still in place today, was then surrounded by an orchard and by a garden, and that will come to play a part in this battle. Here's the Miller's home. It gives you a sense for what it looked like, and it looks not unlike this today, at least the house itself. But what I want you to focus on is this picket fence over here, because it's long gone, as are all the trees that surround it. And you can see in the background beyond the picket fence some of the trees that were in the orchard. It shows that the Miller farmhouse was a formidable obstacle to attacking Federals. This is the cornfield. Now, this is looking from the Millers' front yard. If you'd walked out past their garden and looked to the south and east, this is the view you would have had. There's the cornfield's fence. You can see the zigzag or Virginia worm fence, as it's often described, and the corn in the field beyond the fence. The trees beyond it are the edge of the East Woods, and you can still see the remnants of some of that, although it's been diminished by thinning out the forest even today. So when you're thinking about the attack, imagine this is the ground that we're going to be discussing. Now, late on the 16th, General McClellan brings General Joseph Hooker to his headquarters and advises him of his battle plan, his 3-pronged battle plan. Hooker will in fact be the only general who is given the details of all 3 of McClellan's phases, and that's because Hooker needs to know how important his action is. He has drawn the toughest job of the 3. That opening attack is going to draw the most of Lee's forces because it's going to be for a time the only attack, and so Hooker knows that he's got a tough task ahead of him. Eventually, he's going to ask for assistance, and in addition to Hooker's own 1st Corps launching this attack, he's going to send to the Union right General Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps. So Hooker will have essentially 2 full corps to launch his opening attack. And when Hooker arrives on the field late on September 16th, 1862, the sun has set and darkness is setting in and rain is coming. So it's difficult for Hooker to see. But what he can see is that box that I talked about surrounded by woods. And Hooker comes up with the plan that you see before you now. This three-prong approach is an adapted form of Hooker's attack, because what he actually plans is a two-prong approach using two of his. Doubleday's division will drive at the same time. Ricketts' division will launch diagonally across the field, and Meade's division, the third of his divisions, will be the reserve that's going to hopefully sustain success and be that final drive on to achieve victory. Well, Hooker decides that he's going to have every man attacking toward this objective, the Dunker Church. Now, even today, that small white Dunker Church stands out as a landmark. And Hooker selected it specifically because everyone on the battlefield could see their objective. So no matter how confusing things got, Union attackers would know where it is they were headed and what they were supposed to be driving toward. So a good part of Joe Hooker's plan, a clear, concise objective that can survive the fog of war that he knows is going to be inevitable once this battle starts. Well, at dawn on September 17th, 1862, the attack begins. Now, remember that Joe Hooker's plan was to send two of his three divisions forward, a typical West Point 2 up, 1 back attack, as we would refer to it today. And the plan was to have all those divisions moving forward, the two divisions moving forward at once. Commanders then could decide how many of their force they wanted to go forward, and both Ricketts and Doubleday selected two brigades to attack. Ricketts, in fact, sent all three of his brigades forward. And at dawn, the attack got underway. Those brigades beginning to move to the attack. But almost at once, it fell apart. In fact, the coordinated timing of launching the attack was the only thing that would survive the opening shots at dawn. The first thing that goes wrong is that Gibbon's attack, as it begins moving south along the Hagerstown Pike, encounters an obstacle that they should have anticipated but did not: the Miller's farmyard. The men run up against the fence that we saw, that white picket fence, and the men begin immediately tearing at the fence to tear it down, but it will not yield. And they begin working together to try and break the fence down. And eventually, one of the regiments goes so far as to give up and simply having the men fall out and reform on the other side of Margaret Miller's orchard fence. Eventually, Gibbon's brigade, leading Doubleday's attack, will move around the fence and the farmyard in particular, but the time that slowed their advance bought time for the Confederates to move forces up, and now Gibbon begins receiving fire from the west woods, concealed fire, and Gibbon's attack, Doubleday's entire division, is slowed by having to respond to the fire coming from the west woods. Meanwhile, Ricketts' attack, that seems to have fewer obstacles in its path, actually encounters even more problems. Brigadier General Hartsuff, who was supposed to be leading the attack, his most skilled, most trusted general, is wounded in the opening moments of the action. Even before his brigade begins moving forward, Hartsuff is taken from the field. And his second in command has no idea what the plan is. And so Hartsuff's brigade, one of the two that's supposed to be driving diagonally through that field toward the Dunker Church, stalls. Christian's brigade, that was supposed to be their reinforcements, then finds itself in a slightly different mission. Instead of going behind Duryea and Hartsuff, he is sent around the East Woods to attack something that had appeared in the morning light, forced Joe Hooker to change and Ricketts to change their plan. And that is this force here. Stonewall Jackson, the night before, had put a salient out in front of the cornfield to oppose exactly what Joe Hooker is planning to do. And so Christian Brigade is supposed to be moving around Eastwoods to strike that flank, and it's nowhere to be found. So Duryea's brigade, the only brigade that is at this point in order, begins moving diagonally through the field. Joe Hooker's opening attack, 2 divisions, 5 brigades, that was supposed to be the spearhead of George McClellan's opening action, has now devolved to a single Federal brigade advancing through the open. Duryea's men advance as best they can. But once they reach the southern end of the cornfield, that bit that I read earlier, opening our session, Duryea's men find themselves in a tremendous firefight. Lieutenant Rush Cady of the 97th New York, Company K, the center of Duryea's brigade, wrote of the fighting there. Storrs Sherman was squatting down in the act of priming when hit by a solid shot, which literally severed both legs at the knees and took off his right hand at the wrist. The same shot killing Dick Handley instantly, going completely through his body. Sherman's blood, flesh, and pieces of bone flew all over and in the faces of the boys who were next to him. He asked for a drink of water and then begged Alex to cut his throat. He was in such agony. John Whiteside, who described the advance through the cornfield earlier, wrote, "We were severely cut up, perfectly slaughtered, but our general was determined to hold that point at all hazards until reinforced." General Duryea did try and hold that line, but the intense fire of Confederates under Lawton's brigade and Trimble's brigade held that position. Having picked out a line in the corn, Colonel Marcellus Douglas, commanding Lawton's brigade, told the men to fire low and make each shot count. And it's now that those shots do begin to count. Duryea's men get no farther. His left-handmost units, the 104th and 105th New York, advance out of the cornfield and into the open, but are quickly driven back. And it's at this moment that my own ancestor, my cousin Robert Austin in the 105th New York, is wounded here in the cornfield, my own personal connection to this action. Well, as Duryea begins to fall back into the corn, realizing that he must retreat or lose his entire brigade, Lawton's and Hayes brigades, sent forward to reinforce Trimble and Lawton, begin advancing forward. They push forward and retake the cornfield. And they get about halfway into the cornfield before they too are halted. Now Hartsuff's brigade has moved into the fight, and Gibbon's brigade has finally got itself back on track and is moving forward. Both its flanks threatened. Lawton's and Hayes' advance stalls nearly in the center of the cornfield. And now another tremendous firefight opens up between Hartsuff's brigade and Hayes' brigade. And some of the highest casualties of the entire battle are incurred here in this moment. What changes this for the Union is that Gibbon's brigade continues to advance, pushing Lawton back and advancing farther south along the turnpike. They nearly reach the southern end of the cornfield and begin to push forward toward the Confederate flank. And it seems that finally Hooker's attack is on the verge of success. The 6th Wisconsin's Major Rufus Dawes wrote of that moment. Men I cannot say fell, they were knocked out out of the ranks by the dozens. But we jumped over the fence and pushed on, firing, loading, and shouting as we advanced. Men and officers of New York and Wisconsin were fused together into a common mass in the frantic struggle fast. Everybody tears cartridges, loads, passes guns, or shoots. Men are falling in their places or running back into the corn. The soldier was shooting is furious with energy. Gibbon's brigade nearly has success until suddenly Hood's division of Confederates emerges from behind the Dunker Church. Now, Gibbon had advanced too far and now was exposed, and Hood's advance into the open field changes everything. Major Dawes wrote of Hood's advance, "A long and steady line of rebel gray is unbroken by the fugitives who fly before us, comes sweeping down through the woods and around the church. They raise the yell and fire. It is like a scythe running through our line. Now it's a race for life that every man runs for the cornfield." As the Texans and of Wolford's brigade and Law's brigade advance into the cornfield and begin pushing forward, they retake the cornfield yet again for the South. And as they advance, things begin to look increasingly possible that finally the South may drive away this attack and retake the cornfield and restore that position for the South. But then disaster strikes. The two brigades under Hood's division, Wolford and Law, increasingly are fighting separate actions. Instead of moving forward together, Wolford is being pulled into a fight across the Hagerstown Pike, responding to men of Gibbon's brigade and of Patrick's brigade sent to reinforce them, and Phelps' brigade. So now Doubleday's entire division has drawn Wolford into a fight in exactly the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Law's brigade pushes forward almost to the northern edge of the cornfield's fence, and they too are fighting a separate action. Law putting troops in the southern end of the East Woods as an anchor for his action. But as these two fights advance, they diverge, and now the center is weakened. And into that, General Hood sends the 1st Texas, hoping to shore up that open gap. But instead of posting on Wolford's right to connect the two brigades, the 1st Texas moved forward. Hood would later say that the men had slipped the bridle and got away from the command. It's every officer's nightmare. He has lost control. The 1st Texas, the men simply surged forward, reaching almost to the northern end of the cornfield's fence. And while this might well have been success, in this case, it's disaster. The 1st Texas is driven back, and now the center of Hood's division is exposed at the very moment that Meade's Pennsylvania reserves, Hooker's last fresh brigade division, is sent into the fight. And now Hood's division is driven back. The Federals retake the cornfield yet again. And just as Meade reaches the southern end of the cornfield and pushes beyond into the open ground beyond it, suddenly into the fight comes Ripley's brigade. Now, Ripley had been sent forward by General D.H. Hill, whose men were sitting in the Sunken Road, essentially watching this fight as it unfolds, as the sun begins to rise higher in the morning sky. Ripley marches into the center of the field, essentially taking the ground that Law had abandoned, and marches north, opposed by no one, because as Meade's force advanced, it realized that there were Confederates in the southern end of the East Woods. And so rather than advancing it as a unified force, Meade's division becomes divided. essentially a stair step form, the left-hand portion moving farther forward, the right hand stuck in the northern end of the cornfield. And it's into that gap that Ripley's brigade advances and takes the center of the cornfield once again for the South. Now Hooker's committed his entire First Corps and things are beginning to look bleak, but he has an ace in his hand in the form of the 12th Corps, 7,500 men of the 12th Corps under General J.K.F. Mansfield. Now, the 12th Corps is an unusual corps. It's barely been together for a few months as a corps, and Mansfield has been with the corps for only a few days, not even an entire week. And worse, Mansfield lacks any confidence in his men and his officers. Mansfield is an old Army officer with a fair amount of skill. He'd fought in Mexico, but it's his first time on a Civil War battlefield, and this is fighting of a scale he's never seen before. Regardless, he leads his men onto the field, and initially Hooker plans to have them attack exactly in the way that the First Corps had, going through the cornfield, heading for the Dunkard Church. And they begin deploying. Gordon's brigade, the first on the field, deploys in the center of the cornfield's northern edge and begins to move south. And then Hooker changes his mind. He realizes that those troops, those Confederate forces in the southern end of the cornfield, 3 Confederate regiments that were not really intended to be there, they'd simply sort of stumbled into that position, holding that ground, need to be cleared away first. Hooker realizes without controlling the East Woods, he cannot control the cornfield. Without controlling the cornfield, he cannot attack that Dunkard Church Ridge and achieve McClellan's first objective. And so he shifts his plan, leaving Gordon's brigade to hold the northern end of the cornfield, to control it by fire alone, and contesting that control against Ripley's Confederate brigade. He begins to move troops around the eastern side of the East Woods to take that position. Mansfield, lacking confidence in his troops, decides that he must move these men into position himself. And so he rides one regiment at a time, posting them. In doing so, Mansfield exposes himself and takes a round in doing so. Mortally wounded, Mansfield is carried from the field. He will later die of his wounds sustained here at the East Woods. Well, fortunately for the Union, General Alpheus Williams will step into his role very easily. Hooker quickly tells him what his plan is, and Williams begins moving to implement Hooker's plan for the 12th Corps. Now, that plan is to send Greene's division, the brigades of Tyndale and Stainrook, around to sweep through the East Woods to deal with the Confederates there, and that the 2 forces, now Gordon's brigade and the remnants of the First Corps holding the cornfield's northern end, would then hold a position on which that division of Greene would swing like a barn door, sweeping the Confederates out of the cornfield and heading due west toward the Dunkard Church. Hopefully, finally taking McClellan's first objective for this battle. But as they do, Ripley's brigade that's been holding this position has now been worn threadbare thin. Unfortunately for the South, General D.H. Hill sends forward Colquitt's brigade, another of his brigades that have been sitting in the Sunken Road, and they advance and move around the front of Ripley's brigade, providing essentially a living wall of soldiers to protect them. And seizing that ground, they retake the cornfield and advance almost to the northern edge of it. And it seems that just as Hooker's plan is beginning to unfold, Colquitt will undo it. But General Jackson knows that without support in the East Woods, that position will collapse. And he sends Garland's brigade under Colonel McCrae, Duncan McCrae, into the East Woods to reinforce them. Now, Garland's brigade had lost its commander and a considerable number of men at South Mountain on the 14th. And that loss had caused the brigade to lose its confidence. McCrae, an inexperienced commander, leads his men into the East Woods, and almost at once they begin to break. The men are unconfident, lack confidence in themselves and their position. And it's at just that moment that Greene's division begins sweeping into that field. There's confusion in Confederate ranks. Garland's brigade is beginning to offer a scattered fire. The officers tell the men, no, those are our own troops, confusing the three regiments that had been holding the Eastwoods for so long as being the enemy or being their friendly troops. The officers tell the men to stop. And it's at that moment that Tyndale's and Steinrook's brigades of Greene's division swing like a barn door into the East Woods and sweep all before them. Colonel Colquitt wrote of that moment, "We were exposed to a fire from nearly all sides and surrounded." The 66th Ohio's Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Powell wrote, "We immediately opened fire on the enemy, who soon broke. The enemy retired to a cornfield, followed by us. And while in the corn, our regiment engaged a Georgia regiment in hand-to-hand combat, using clubbed guns, a portion of the men having no bayonets. The enemy at this point was severely punished." As Greene's division swings into the East Woods and through the cornfield, they now drive for the Dunker Church Ridge. And they finally begin to have some hope of achieving the objective that Joe Hooker and General McClellan had set. But it's at this moment that Joe Hooker will be wounded. At some point earlier in the action, he had taken a round in the foot and had ignored it, continuing to ride the field to personally deploy batteries to oversee the implementation of his revised plan. But eventually Joe Hooker can take it no more. Swooning, he falls from the saddle. His aides rush to gather him up, and an aide realizes his foot is bleeding. Removing his boot, the aide pours Hooker's blood onto the ground in a great stream. The architect of this action now has been taken from the field at the moment of critical decision, and it's now that the battle will turn to fall on the hands of other men. Edmund Vaux Sumner will ride onto the field with his Second Corps, at least Sedgwick's division of that corps, to reinforce Hooker. And it's he who will take over and will change the axis of this action and will lead the fight that will go on into the West Woods. Greene's division, meanwhile, will advance up to the ridge near the Dunker Church, the ground on which today's National Park Visitor Center stands, and for lack of ammunition will sit there for an hour before advancing on their own into the West Woods. The battle will go on. But in only 2 hours, the cornfield action has already generated tremendous casualties. The Union losing 2,589 casualties, now that's killed and wounded and missing, and of official counts, 417 killed, but I'm going to talk about that number in a few minutes. And the Confederates had lost 3,619 casualties, 717 of those killed. The highest regimental costs in the entire Battle of Antietam had been incurred in those 2 hours. The 12th Massachusetts in Hartsuff's brigade that had fought against Hayes' Confederates in the cornfield in the opening moments of the battle lost 49 killed, 165 wounded, 64% casualties. The 1st Texas, however, that regiment that had slipped the bridle and reaching the northern end of the cornfield had been driven back by Meade's Pennsylvania reserves, had lost 45 killed of 226 engaged, 82.6% casualties, the highest number in the Battle of Antietam for any regiment. In fact, the highest number for any regiment in the entire Civil War in any given battle. You can see the cost of the cornfield action. And many of us are familiar with the physical cost of this. We've seen the casualties. This image, I'm sure all of us have seen. It graces the cover of many books, and justifiably so. It shows the Dunkirk Church, what a great objective and clear objective it was, as well as some of the men who fell defending it on the Confederate side. Many of us are also familiar with this image of men, mostly Confederates at this point, who had fought on the western side of the Hagerstown Pike. That road, the road is in fact the other side of the fence. That two-lane path that you see, in fact, was a wagon road created by artillery moving. These troops, too, we're familiar with. And this is the Elliott Map. Some of you may have heard about the Elliott Map's discovery earlier this year by two researchers who found it in the New York Public Library. Elliott had created a map in 1864 that documents the casualties as they stood at that moment in time. In doing so, Elliott gave us a vital piece of information that allows us to today say that the numbers that were recorded, those 417 killed on the federal side in the cornfield, the 717 traditionally known, are simply too low. My own count of Elliott's map, of the graves depicted in Elliott's map, in fact, shows 1,712 Confederate dead and 1,021 Federal dead just in that cornfield action. So you can see that the numbers we have traditionally thought of for this battle are simply much, much too low. Well, the action here, despite the casualties, is just the beginning. General McClellan's first phase remained incomplete. Jackson held the line, but just barely. There was a tremendous amount of fighting still to come. The West Woods action, the Sunken Road, the Burnside Bridge. But the cornfield's impact, the cornfield action, which is so difficult to understand that it's been mostly ignored in favor of those easier to understand actions in the Sunken Road or the West Woods or the Burnside Bridge, resonate throughout this battle. The casualty figures you see there for the entire battle are simply a reflection of the cost of fighting the cornfield action. Because the Battle of Antietam, as it unfolded, reflected that both sides had been essentially bled dry by what had happened in the cornfield that morning in just 2 hours of fighting. And I think it's Major Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin who sums up best what had happened in Miller's cornfield when he wrote, "Whoever stood in front of the cornfield at Antietam needs no praise." And I think the challenge for us as Americans today is to remember that sacrifice, to remember that fighting, and to keep alive the sacrifices of those men who fought at Antietam's cornfield. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions anybody might have.
All right. All right, can you guys see me and hear me? All right. All right. So, Dave, was McClellan the commander of the overall forces at this point?
Yeah, so at this point, the overall Union commander was Henry Halleck. George McClellan commanded the Army of the Potomac that engages in this action. At this point, McClellan had been removed from that command to focus on leading troops in the field.
Okay, alrighty. Next question. What was the overall size of the forces involved in this battle? And I'm assuming that means both Union and Confederate.
Yeah, that's a great question. The size of the forces in both sides. Find my numbers here so I get them right, because I have not just memorized all of them. So on the Confederate side, in the cornfield, overall engaged troops, 55,956 federal troops, 37,351 Confederate troops. Now, those are numbers engaged, and I read those exact numbers and needed to look them up because there's a lot of controversy about numbers engaged at Antietam. In part, this is because General McClellan would use different figures over the years to characterize the numbers engaged. There's still an intense debate among historians about the actual numbers that were involved. McClellan tended to count only his troops engaged, where he looked at all of the Confederates. So he counted Teamsters, he counted rear guards, he counted troops that never made it to the front, and he only would ever count his own troops that were engaged actually at the front. The Fourth Corps, for example, under Darius Couch, never gets counted because it was in the rear. So there are different counting schemes. That's the one that I like to use because it's the number of troops on both sides that we count as being engaged in the actual fighting, not available to be in the field.
Okay. All right. We've got some time here. So next question. Can you comment on the bloody angle? Good luck with that one. Keep it under half an hour.
Oh, yeah. Do you mean the Sunken Road? Is that what?
I think that's what, yes.
I assume they mean? Because
Yeah.
Yeah, that easily is another presentation. I actually think this is one of the most interesting portions of Antietam that is the least understood. I think the fighting in the Sunken Road essentially accounts for a lot of deaths to no purpose. And the reason I say that is because the action there had no connection to the tactical actions of the commander on the field. Edwin Vos Sumner had no clue other than that Franklin's division wasn't coming to reinforce Sedgwick in the West Woods. That much we know he knew because his son and aide Samuel Sumner was sent to tell Franklin where to deploy, French, and he got confused, we think. So we know that at some point Sumner knew that those forces were not coming. But later on, Sumner sends McClellan a message at his headquarters asking him to tell him where French is. So he knew he wasn't coming, but apparently lost track of French, which to me shows that all the fighting in the Sunken Road was disconnected from Sumner's plan for fighting on the Union right, the Confederate left, and that those actions under General French and General Richardson, as costly as they were, really had no great impact until late in the day. And I talk about this in my book because there's more to the cornfield fight than the portion that I've talked about in the morning. Late in the day when Lee wants to go on the offensive, because Lee's plan wasn't just to sit on the defense and wear down the Union attacker. He did that with a purpose of letting McClellan wear his forces out, then he would go on the offense. Mm-hmm. Well, late in the day, the very troops that, had they sat in the Sunken Road and not been engaged by French and Richardson, might have been fresh and available, D.H. Hill's division, other than those brigades that fought in the cornfield. Those troops were simply battered to pieces by French and Richardson. So it did have an impact, but not the one that most of us think it had. I hope that answers the question.
Well, as much as you could, given the time we had.
Yeah, yeah.
Really. And that's a really loaded question in a lot of ways. So here's an interesting one. How did the British formally respond to this battle relative to Lee's initial hopes to have them enter the war for the Confederates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the British initially were dismissive of this battle. The Confederates, Confederate ministers in London had been told, well, we know you're winning these battles in Virginia, but heck, anybody can defend their home. What we need you to do is go fight a battle in the North that can show your worth risking our blood and treasure on, because they were really hoping that the Confederates would win, the United States would split in two, and it would spend its entire history fighting each other, which, given the way things are going, might well have happened. So Britain initially was dismissive of this action. And then when Lincoln used Antietam as the justification for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, it was even worse. They said, see, this just shows that Lincoln and the North are spent. They have to resort to desperate means. But, and in fact, initially, it seemed that the South, although they didn't win Antietam and it wasn't the battle he wanted, that they might have achieved the strategic gain that they wanted, that Britain might come in on their side. But Lincoln's issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was a strategic masterstroke, because despite those initial criticisms, the people in Britain, the populace, was very anti-slavery, and they would not become involved in a war to support a slaveholding power. So once Lincoln reframed the war as from a war to preserve the Union, as it was, to a war to end slavery by preserving the Union, that closed the door forever to British involvement. It took a few months for that to occur, but eventually British ministers or Union ministers in London reported that the tide had turned, at the Palmerston government simply hadn't the support in Parliament, and it never had the support on the street to involve Britain militarily in this war. And now the North would be free to pursue a war however long it took and however costly it became to achieve victory.
Good answer. And of course, the backdrop to all that is the fact that England wanted Confederate cotton.
That's right.
Because after all, the Industrial Revolution was driven by textile manufacturing in England.
That's right.
So
yeah, and a lot of the mills had begun to shut down, but another thing that had begun to change was that Britain had found new sources for cotton in Egypt, in India, and in South America. So those were beginning to show up, and the mills were just starting back to work. So it took some of the sting out of King cotton being denied to British mills.
Yep, absolutely. We have lots of comments that are just basically saying, thank you, great talk, appreciate it. And of course, as you can see in Dave's last slide, you see the book, The Dust Jacket. And one comment says that I'm going out to buy a couple of copies of your book, so hopefully it'll help. You can now retire Dave, a wealthy man.
Yeah,
we'll see what happens.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, and I'll be happy if anyone wants to send me questions to my email account there or through the website. I'm happy to answer those. If people would like books signed, they can send them to me, or I'll send the book plates that they can paste in the book.
All right. We still got some time for one or two more questions. So I'm going to go through. All right. So were there any Union officers whose careers were significantly advanced due to their actions at Antietam, and who may have later fought at Gettysburg? That's a question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the advanced side, Joe Hooker's career certainly was enhanced by this, as was Ambrose Burnside, despite the fact that his actions were less than sterling in fighting the Burnside Bridge portion, which I didn't talk about tonight, but certainly talk about at least briefly in the book. His career, both of their careers were advanced, and of course, both of them would go on to command the
Army of the Potomac.
yeah, exactly, the Army of the Potomac. There are many other officers who certainly were involved in the fighting in the cornfield. Beyond that, whose careers were advanced. Green's division at Gettysburg and Culp's Hill played an important role, and his action at Antietam is also worth examining. It's another case of command breakdown because Green's division sat there where the visitor center is today. Once they got ammunition, he went into the West Woods, took the Dunkard Church, and was on the verge of breaking Lee's line until he was driven back because he believed that Sedgwick was advancing. So Green's career really takes off, and I think George Hughes Green is another one of those generals here that whose achievements in Antietam presage things that will future success and whose achievements are underappreciated.
Yep. Okay. All right. We've got time for one more question. So let me, all right. This might be a little tougher, but if it's not too general a question, which side had the most effective generals taken as a whole? And what are criteria for your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends how you look at what the general's objective is. If it's tactical generals, then clearly the South had the advantage. If McClellan was a linear thinker in how he approached tactical planning and execution of battles, a man who couldn't see opportunities, Lee was the exact opposite. He was an iterative thinker who could see opportunity amidst nothing but disaster and could pull that thread and achieve success. He did it at Chancellorsville. He did it at Second Manassas. He did it so many other times. But battles only count insofar as they win wars. And for the Union, eventually, some of those less competent generals like McClellan, like Hooker, like Burnside were weeded out, and we got generals like Grant, because in my mind, Grant is the greatest strategic general. He understood the South's weaknesses. He knew how to craft a strategic and tactical actions to exploit those weaknesses to advance Union national objectives to win the war. And so where so many other generals were stuck in a tactical mindset of winning the battle was more important than winning the war, Grant understood that winning the battle was simply means to winning the war. And in the end, I think that's why the Union gets the nod for the most effective generals in this war.
Good answer, thanks. Because and I'm sure that answer alone could create all kinds of conversations. So
yes.
So, we're just about out of time. So Dave, thank you very, very much for just a really fascinating program. I mean, it's for anybody who's never been to Antietam, please go. I mean, it is one of the most haunting places you'll ever visit, maybe after Gettysburg in some ways. So, and if you're going to go, contact Dave. He'll give you a guided tour, and I'm sure.
That's right.
No, see, I mean that sincerely, folks. It's the best way to see a battlefield.
Yeah.
Someone else do the talking who really knows what they're talking about. So give that a shot. So Dave, thank you very much, and of course, everybody, buy the book. All right.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
No, it's our great pleasure. Thank you so much. And so, folks. So, okay, I'm going to let you know about 3 programs coming up. On October the 13th, we have a public affairs lecture featuring League member Alan Gelzo and a guest Lenny McAllister, and their subject will be 1619 or 1776. And there you go. It's on the screen. How do you like that? All right. Tuesday, October 20th, we're going to have a little Halloween-y type of program, I hope. A library hour with Tom Keels called Rest in Pieces. And Tom's a great speaker. He knows all the gruesome side to Philadelphia cemetery histories. It will be a really good program and just perfect for Halloween. And then our roundtable in October, Harold Knudsen, who should have been here back in July, but got hurricaned out, so to speak. And here we talking about generals earlier and who succeeded and who didn't. And James Longstreet is probably the Confederacy's most underappreciated, undervalued general. So Harold will talk about that. The Confederacy's most modern general, Longstreet and the American Civil War. So with all of that, everybody, thank you for joining us this evening. We truly do appreciate it. Thanks to the Legacy Foundation for making these Zoom and virtual programs available. Dave, thank you again for taking the time out of your night to be here, and we hope to see you in Philadelphia sometime. Please take us up on that. So there we go, folks, right on time. Thank you all very much. Stay well, stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you the next time, hopefully October the 13th. Good night, everybody.